They laughed when I had nothing. It's funny how memory works, because sometimes I can still hear the echo of their laughter in my head, like a cheap soundtrack to the worst years of my life. Back then, everything in my world felt thin, fragile, easily breakable. My apartment walls were thin, my wallet was thin, my chances were thin, but their voices, loud, sharp, everywhere, they treated me like a walking joke, like someone born to be the footrest under their shiny shoes. They didn't know I would one day become the shadow that stood above them all. Back then I worked at a rundown storage facility on the outskirts of town, a place that smelled like dust, forgotten dreams, and occasionally rat piss on hot days. People like to glamorize the grind, but the truth is that real struggle is quiet. It's waking up with your stomach eating itself, taking the bus next to people pretending not to see you, and pretending not to notice your shoes talking because the soles are separating. I didn't have siblings, and my parents had given me the kind of childhood that required therapy I couldn't afford, so I leaned on myself, even when the weight was too heavy. The real problem wasn't that I had nothing, it was that the people around me wanted to make sure I stayed that way. The facility owner, Hank, was the kind of guy stereotypes are built from: beer belly, red face, and a voice that made every word sound like an insult even when he wasn't trying. And he rarely wasn't trying. He once told me, "Some people are born to lead, some are born to lift what leaders drop. You're the second kind." That was his way of summing up my worth. And then there was the trio, people I call the three laughters, because one thing they did better than anything else was laugh at me. They worked with me on shifts sometimes: Marcus, the supervisor's son, Bethany, the assistant manager with a voice like a rusty swing, and Trip, the guy whose full name I never learned because I never cared. They weren't bad at their jobs, they were bad at being human. Every time I walked into the staff room, they'd stop talking, smirk, and wait for me to sit down just so they could start up their made-for-TV sneering commentary. "Look at him, walking like he owns the place," Marcus said once, when all I owned was a pair of socks with holes and a future even thinner than my paycheck. "Please," Bethany laughed, "he couldn't even own a bicycle." I pretended not to hear, which was a skill I'd eventually master. But the truth, I heard everything. The universe has a strange way of planting seeds in the ruins. For me, the seed came from something small, an old customer whose storage unit had gone unpaid for months. This kind of thing wasn't unusual, except what made it different was what the customer left behind: boxes and boxes of notebooks, sketches, and diagrams. At first glance it looked like the ramblings of a conspiracy theorist, but when I looked closer I realized something. This man had been a genius. A real one. An inventor, a designer, and his notes, full of concepts that had never seen the light of day. I wasn't an engineer, but I wasn't stupid. I started studying every night after work, digging through the boxes in secret, understanding the mechanics, reading diagrams, watching YouTube tutorials until the sun came up. I slept little, worked a lot, and learned more. Months passed and this secret education became an obsession. Then came my idea: a hybrid security and monitoring AI system, compact, scalable, and adaptable, not the flashy type you see in movies, but the kind real companies would kill to get their hands on. It wasn't that I created something totally new, it was that I built something cheaper, smarter, and more flexible than anything on the market. I needed one thing: money to test it. I had none. So I worked more hours, skipped more meals, and sold the few things I owned worth selling. I lived in that thin space between hunger and ambition until the day I convinced a small local investor, a retired police chief, to give me $15,000. It wasn't much, but it was oxygen. The first prototype was ugly as hell, but it worked. And when the retired chief showed it to people he knew, real people with real connections, everything shifted. Meetings were scheduled, doors opened. Suddenly the same universe that had left me starving was spoon-feeding opportunities into my hands. It took 2 years of non-stop work, sleepless nights, cancelled holidays, and self-doubt thick enough to drown in, but the product launched, and people noticed. Within 9 months I had contracts, within 12 expansion, within 18 investors were calling me instead of the other way around. Within 3 years I owned a company whose annual revenue had a comma where my rent money used to have lint. People say success is loud. Mine was silent, a rising tide no one saw until it washed over everything they thought they controlled. So imagine my face when Hank came into my office building one morning, wearing his best and still terrible shirt, walking with the humility of a man who had believed he would never need it. He didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? Last time he saw me, I was thin, tired, and forgettable. Now my suit cost more than 3 months of his mortgage. He sat in the waiting room clutching a resume that looked like a paper begging for mercy. When he finally looked up and saw me standing there, his face dropped, sagged, spilled disappointment. "You," he choked. I smiled. "Me." He stammered something. I think it was an apology or maybe a plea, but I interrupted him. "You once told me some people are born to lead," I said. "Turns out some people are just born wrong." He didn't laugh, not this time. I hired him, not because I needed him, but because he needed the job more than I needed him to have one. Karma doesn't always kill its victims, sometimes it just makes them live differently. But that wasn't even the beginning. One by one, the 3 laughters found their way to my shadow. Marcus was first. He applied for an entry-level logistics position after losing his supervisor job. I interviewed him personally. He didn't recognize me until halfway through the interview when I adjusted my glasses the same way I used to do back at the storage facility. His eyes widened. His voice cracked. He apologized so fast he sounded like a malfunctioning robot. "You're hired," I said calmly. Bethany came next through a temp agency. She walked into the office, saw me, and nearly dropped the clipboard. The years had not been kind to her voice or her spirit. She tried to avoid eye contact. It didn't matter. Fate has a way of handing people back the weight they once threw at others. Trip, he turned out to be the easiest catch. A DUI, a job loss, and a bankrupt roommate situation later, he practically begged for a steady job. All 3 of them ended up under my management. All 3 of them signed paperwork with hands that shook. All 3 of them worked in a department where the hierarchy was clear, established, and undeniable. Above them, me. Below me, the people who once made sure I stayed beneath them. I didn't fire them. Firing is mercy. Mercy was never part of my revenge. Instead, I treated them fairly, professionally, neutrally, the same way I wished they had treated me, but fairness hits differently when someone expects you to punish them. The guilt eats them alive. The fear becomes its own torment. They laughed when I had nothing. Now they worked under the shadow of the man they once mocked, and every time they saw me walk by, every time they heard my voice, every time I asked for a report, they remembered exactly what they did. My revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was simple. I became everything they said I could never be, and they became everything they feared they would one day become. Success is quiet, but the silence under my shadow, that silence is the loudest sound they've ever heard. And I hear no laughter anymore. Not from them. Not ever again.